Hello and welcome to another analytical video, this time focusing on ranking the chapters of the Adeptus Astartes. So, without further ado, let's get to it. My review/analysis on ranking the Space Marine chapters. When the thought for this concept first crossed my mind, I figured it may make for an interesting video. Such a subject would require digging into the data, evaluating, comparing, and contrasting the various mechanics available to all the chapters. And sifting through all that data would be quite the task. But then I thought,
you know, I'm something of a scientist myself.
As longtime viewers will know, I quite enjoy that kind of work. Although sometimes it leads to rants on faulty mechanics, revealed inconsistencies, or even neglect, which I feel as though are accepted far too readily and aren't spoken about enough, hence why I make videos on those subjects. However, that isn't the case here, as the Space Marines are in a pretty great place presently in 9th edition. So with that stated, I should probably set the framing. This video isn't going to be a top 10 tier list. It's not trying to advocate which chapters are definitively the best or worst. That level of analysis would require a far lengthier video, as I feel such evaluations are really hard to qualify without going through the many mechanics and explaining the justifications for said assessments. Instead, this video will paint a picture of each chapter's playstyle on the tabletop, demonstrating how each chapter's mechanics skew, which I think is a pretty useful thing for players out there who are looking to build a new army and potentially see if a particular subfaction will provide the mechanical style they are looking for. And while it would be fairly uninteresting to do a rule-by-rule assessment, I will alternatively explain the process/methods I used so you can understand how I arrived at the results. Conversely, if you don't care to see the how and just want to see the results, jump ahead to this timecode. When I made the initial pitch of the idea, I explained that the chapters could be categorized on a spectrum between efficiency and flexibility, and it wasn't long before I was already thinking that the spectrum could benefit from the inclusion of another axis, that being shooting and melee. Pretty obvious, as those are the two categories of combat interaction, so it makes sense to include them as it provides a much better picture of the chapter or any faction's playstyle. As for determining the qualifications for assessment, by and large, a chapter or subfaction's overarching playstyle or specialty will be distilled in their army-wide rules, and I theorized that, in assessing them, should yield results that demonstrate how each of the chapters differ relative to each other. For Space Marines, this takes the form of their chapter tactics and their doctrine specialties. And the 4 attributes we will measure those mechanics against are efficiency, flexibility, shooting, and melee. When assessing a rule, a tally is added to any of the categories that rule or mechanic is benefiting. I will explain the qualifiers for efficiency and flexibility, as shooting and melee is pretty self-explanatory. A rule that scores in efficiency would be any rule that provides performance improvements in either stats or probability, as they pertain to damage-dealing interactions, such as Forged in Battle's reroll to wound, or Grim Resolve's +1 to hit. These are rules that are improving performance and making a toolkit more efficient. A rule that scores in flexibility would be any rule that provides exceptions to the foundational rules present in the core rulebook, such as Lightning Assault's ability to advance or fall back and charge, or the Hunter's Unleashed perk, of letting non-character units perform heroic interventions, both of which are rules which grant exceptions to the core mechanics of the game. So for a chapter like the Ultramarines, from their chapter tactic, add 1 to leadership would be a notch in efficiency, and for their second perk, allowing units to fall back and shoot with a hit penalty, would be a notch in flexibility, due to that being an exception to a core rule, but also a notch in shooting since it's specifically benefiting shooting attacks. And from their doctrine bonus, Scions of Guilliman, letting units not count as moving for the purpose of shooting attacks, would add a notch in flexibility, due to it being an exception providing benefits to bolter discipline in addition to circumventing the moving with heavy weapons penalty, which also counts as a benefit towards shooting. Then, after adding up the values, and arraying those attribute spectrums as a grid, the result places the Ultramarines here, fairly balanced on efficiency versus flexibility, with a slight skew towards flexibility, and far more focused towards shooting, which seems fine enough. So the same process was followed for all the other chapters like so. And immediately there are some issues. Some chapters like the Imperial Fists and Space Wolves landed similar to where I thought they would, but others like the Raven Guard and White Scars are effectively misrepresented, since in their cases, their army-wide rules don't happen to distill their toolkit's attributes, at least as far as my conceptions of them. There is also this area here, where the Dark Angels, Salamanders, and Iron Hands all align. I could wear such an overlap if it was just the Salamanders and Iron Hands, but it feels odd for the Dark Angels to be lumped in with them. Then it struck me, this analysis is missing another two pretty vital components. One being mobility, and the second being resiliency. However, adding in another spectrum kind of breaks how the data can be displayed within this format, which meant I needed to go back to square one and find a new format. So I did a little digging, and I arrived at a radar-style chart. And with a little customizing, I created the format which was used in the final analysis. We have a spectrum for efficiency versus flexibility, melee versus shooting, and movement versus defense/restoratives. For those curious, I built these charts using LiveGap, so if you're interested in a free online chart making tool, check out charts.livegap.com, link in the description. But there remained a problem. Even with the added spectrum of mobility and defense, the army-wide rules for the Raven Guard skew them as a defensive chapter, and fails to represent their flexibility. Which annoyed me to no end, as my opinion had always been, that was their forte, and on that initial spectrum where the Imperial Fists were the most efficient, the Raven Guard would likely be the most flexible. But their army-wide rules don't score in flexibility, so there was no way around it. To get a more accurate result demanded a more comprehensive analysis. So, I got down to it. I evaluated all the back-end mechanics in each supplement, those being stratagems, relics, warlord traits, and psychic powers, and litanies if applicable. And I largely followed the same methodology as what I demonstrated with the Ultramarines chapter tactic. For those curious on the details, here's the rubric I used. When assessing the many mechanics, I did omit ones I deemed not qualifiable, such as stratagems which give special issue war gear to sergeants or relics to successors, involve tactical objectives, stratagems that are specific to rival factions, and offensive-only psychic powers. And lastly, I did not count mechanics which affect buffs or debuffs to leadership, since those mechanics are essentially a soft support to either offensive efficiency or defense, but fails to be representative of those attributes to the same degree as the more standard mechanics which score in those attributes. And once the mechanics were evaluated, each attribute's total values were measured against the number of qualifiable mechanics per supplement, which yields a percentile value of each chapter's ranked attributes. All said, I think that this structure paints a far more accurate visual of a chapter's offerings and playstyle. Now onto the results. Before we get into the breakdown itself, there are two important factors I want to reiterate. These comparisons and values are not representative of a chapter's efficacy in those areas, since the assessment is only measuring them in a binary capacity. And two, regardless of how chapters may skew, there is an underlying foundational level of mechanics that all chapters can leverage within the core codex, which is further bolstered by unit selection. So here's an example on how to read these charts. As it relates to the rubric, 35 qualifiable mechanics refers to the amount of rules that were able to be evaluated based on the methodology described earlier. The number within the brackets refers to the number of rules related to leadership which were omitted from evaluation, in this case one mechanic which improved leadership positively. Looking at the chart itself, offensive efficiency relates to mechanics which offer performance increases relating to damage output. Offensive efficiency also informs shooting and melee propensities. So between these three, you can read how a chapter's combat potency and preference skews. Defense/restoratives are just that, methods to mitigate damage or regain wounds. Flexibility refers to exceptions to core rules, and abilities to restrict enemy play. It's also worthy of note that factions with high flexibility will often have means of mitigating damage through control/restrictions provided by those exceptions. However, unlike defensive mechanics, they will require finesse and good player sensibilities to execute. Mobility, in addition to visualizing how fast a chapter is, importantly informs how effective a chapter will be with regards to capitalizing on their melee offensive efficiency. And chapters which score high in flexibility and mobility will typically have a more dynamic playstyle than chapters scoring low in those areas. To gain some context with regards to how chapters score, I have put together the mean averages of all chapters' attributes here, charted in purple, with the dotted stroke. Let's start with the Ultramarines, since they are the marketing face of the faction, and take it in Legion order from there. So here are the Ultramarines, who have 35 qualifiable mechanics out of 43, with 2 mechanics related to leadership. The offensive efficiency rating being close to average means the Ultramarines are fairly efficient, but have an above average propensity for ranged combat. Having average scores in melee and offensive efficiency allows them to be fairly potent in melee combat, but their below average mobility hampers their means to execute dramatic melee assaults. As far as defensive mechanics go, they have a below average amount of tools at their disposal, but to make up for those lacks, they have a considerably high flexibility rating, which effectively means the Ultramarines will have an above average amount of aces up their sleeves, and typically have the means to fight on their terms, which correlates pretty well to their narrative position of being tactically flexible in their manner of warfare. On to the Dark Angels. Now this is slightly anticlimactic, as the Dark Angels don't have their supplement. Their index provides them with 24 mechanics relative to the typical 43 average of the standard supplements. There is no way to know if these rankings will stay relative when their supplement eventually comes out, but here's where they are currently. The Dark Angels take on a shape very close to the average, although lacking in melee, and also score slightly below average in flexibility. But they do score slightly above average in the remaining attributes of mobility, defense, shooting, and offensive efficiency. All that said, they are quite the picture of balance, a position that seems rightly suitable for the 1st Legion. Immediately we can see the White Scars score extremely high in mobility compared to the faction average, with progressively smaller increases in melee and flexibility relative to the mean average. It's actually a pretty great shape overall. They score highly in the 3 key attributes a faction would require to excel as dynamic melee specialists. And as a bonus, the White Scars do have a slightly above average offensive efficiency rating, and are quite shooty, all of which come at the cost of defensive mechanics. The Space Wolves have 37 qualifiable mechanics, and as a side note, it's good to see the new Space Wolves supplement providing the standard amount of mechanics, and not more Marine power creep in terms of volume of rules being provided. When it comes to their graph, the Space Wolves skew hard in melee, no surprises there. They have average offensive efficiency, but are quite above average in terms of flexibility, just a tick above the White Scars. But this comes at the cost of having a far below average amount of shooting mechanics. But what I would argue is more important is their mobility is pretty much average, which for a melee specialist chapter may be less than ideal. However, the Space Wolves make up for this by maintaining an average defensive score, making them one of the hardier melee specialist chapters. The Imperial Fists have a slightly below average amount of mechanics at 38. Due to much of their printed real estate being taken up by the Crimson Fists. You would think they could throw in an extra page or two, but it is what it is. Of their 38 mechanics, 30 are qualifiable. And surprise surprise, the Imperial Fists score obscenely high in offensive efficiency, shooting, and defense, at the cost of the remaining 3 attributes. Most notably mobility, which is at 0, with melee and flexibility, which are both substantially below average. Side note, Crimson Fists essentially skew the same, as adding in their 6 mechanics doesn't skew the chart too much. Next, the Black Templars, which are also operating out of an index, granting them 27 qualifiable mechanics. The Black Templars skew very differently to that of the Imperial Fists, taking on a shape quite similar to the Space Wolves, scoring slightly lower in defense, shooting, and offensive efficiency, for a pretty substantial bump in flexibility and a slight tick in mobility. The Blood Angels are the last of the chapters currently operating out of a 9th edition index, and it provides them with 15 mechanics, with 14 of them being qualifiable. Like the Dark Angels, time will tell how drastic their supplement may alter how their playstyle skews. As they are, the Blood Angels take on a hard-hitting, melee-oriented shape, scoring quite above average in offensive efficiency, mobility, and melee focus, trading defense, flexibility, and shooting for those gains. Worthy of note is they do maintain a relatively higher amount of shooting mechanics for a melee-focused chapter. What the Blood Angels lack in flexibility compared to their melee contemporaries, they make up for with their exceptional focus in offensive efficiency, combined with a strong mobility score and a more than adequate propensity for melee situates them well to deal major damage in the fight phase, really emblemizing the Angels of Death that are the Space Marines. Unsurprisingly, the Iron Hands skew heavily towards defense, nearly doubling the faction average with all their focus on resiliency and repair. They also have an above-average preference for range attacks. Those gains come at the cost of offensive efficiency, flexibility, melee, and mobility, with the former 2 being moderately below average and the latter 2 taking the brunt of the skew. It results in the Iron Hands being the most resilient of the chapters. They are quite slow, but they are fairly efficient and surprisingly flexible, with a strong propensity for ranged combat. And similar to their Forge friends, the Salamanders skew similar to the Iron Hands, although taking on a more balanced shape, trading defense and flexibility for increases in shooting, offensive efficiency, and melee with a tick up in mobility. It cements the Salamanders as efficiently potent all-rounders when it comes to combat, who are also quite durable, but lack in speed and flexibility. Onto the Raven Guard, who take on a pretty unique shape, skewing hard towards flexibility, the highest of any chapter, while also possessing fairly above average ratings in mobility and melee. This comes at the cost of below average rankings in shooting and defense, and the lowest score of all the chapters in offensive efficiency. Interestingly, they foil the Salamanders quite well, both chapters excelling in each other's weaknesses. All said, the Raven Guard are unequivocally the dynamic finesse chapter of the Space Marines, granting powerful exceptions for them to leverage in order to secure victory. And as a bonus, here are the Death Watch. They take on a similar shape to that of the Ultramarines, but trading shooting, offensive efficiency, mobility, and melee for a boost in flexibility and defense. Although this should be taken with a grain of salt, as the Death Watch are just not as comparable as several of their mechanics are locked off for the use against specific Xenos factions. And here they are, all 10 core chapters assessed and their attributes ranked. I think the result turned out quite well, capturing each chapter's playstyle and mechanical offerings rather accurately. I already stated that these aren't measures of efficacy, but since rankings are quite fun, let's do some comparisons. Here are the chapters organized by most efficient. Here they are organized by most flexible, most defensive, and most mobile. Here they are by melee propensity, and here they are by shooting propensity. And we can also compare them based on doctrine specialty. The Devastator Specialist chapters, the Tactical Doctrine Specialist chapters, and the Assault Doctrine Specialist chapters. Well, that's a wrap on this one. Thanks for watching. These were my assessments/rankings on the core Space Marine chapters. It was actually a ton of work, but also rather fun. So I hope you found it interesting if not enjoyable. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to drop them down below. So if you enjoyed this video, there is a like button. And if you want to help this channel grow, there is a subscribe button. There is also a bell button and a share button, so press the buttons you want to press. Thanks again for watching, and I will hope to see you guys in the next one.